Well, this is very exciting because after nearly 20 years of sitting in the audience listening to these kinds of discussions, this is the first time that I have been allowed up here in the seat of power to ask questions. So, welcome, Lauren.
Thank you.
I'm going to start, please, by just asking you about picture books versus chapter books. Because, as Patrick was saying, as we know, Clarice Bean started out as a picture book character.
Mm-hmm.
And now, in this book and in 3 before, I think, she is a chapter book character.
Yep.
Ugly Me, Don't Look Now, Spells Trouble. What can you do in a chapter book that's different from a picture book, and why do you go for one or the other when it's the same character like Clarice Bean?
Okay, so this is my first ever book, and I sort of tricked myself into writing a children's book because I was actually trying to write a film. And that's quite useful because I had many attempts at writing picture books before, and they'd all come out rather dreary, and they all got turned down. And they deserved to be turned down because I think I was trying to write what I thought was a picture book, as if there's a way to do it and you just produce it. And when I started writing this as a film, I started doing it in my own way. So it became a series of drawings and bits of writing all coming out all at once. And because I didn't know what I was doing, I broke a lot of the rules. And that's quite a useful thing to do because you're more likely to do something original if you don't know how to do it. And so I did something that you're not meant to do. So this, for instance, is what we call the end papers. And the end papers are there simply to hold the book to the cover. That's all they're there for. And often people put patterns like this in just so they look nice, but they can be just a plain colour. And with Clarice Bean, because I was writing it from her point of view, so she's 7 and she's talking to you. So it's as if she's knocked on your door, you open the door, and then there you are, you're in their house. And she's talking to you straight away. And she shouldn't be talking to you here because this is not where we do the writing. But it felt very her, because you understand a lot about her, because you know that then she's just one of those people, you knock on the door and she opens it and she starts talking. And then the next thing is exactly the same, where this is called the title page, but this is not the title of the book. That's the title of the book. So it's wrong that it says, "This is me, Clarice Bean." And it's wrong that it doesn't say my name anywhere. It's always meant to say the author's name, and it doesn't. But I felt that gave you more of a sense of who she was. And the first thing she says is, "I haven't got a watch, so I've drawn one on my arm in biro," which has got nothing to do with anything that happens next. So it's a way of sort of getting you right in there so that you suddenly are in Clarice Bean's world. And then she's just taking you through her house, basically. And all the pictures are done differently. So this one, they're having an argument. So there's no background because you don't need a background, because when you're having an argument with somebody, you forget where you are. And so you can behave very rudely and inconsiderately because all you care about is getting your, argument across and telling the other person that they're an idiot or something. And that's what she's doing here with her brother, because they get very cross with each other.
But one of the things you see in this slide is that the text changes according to who's...
Here we go. We're nearly there.
Okay.
Is it on there? Yes.
Yeah.
There we go.
The text changes according to who's speaking. So when Meinl Cricket is speaking, it's this quite sort of thick, slightly handwriting text.
Because he's quite little, so he's like as a crayon.
Yeah. And then when Mum's speaking, she's got this rather elegant, stylish text which sort of floats around the page. And is it true that you did design that, and then they told you you couldn't do that, or that wasn't how a picture book was created.
Oh yeah, so I wrote the book, and then it took 5 years to actually convince anyone to publish it, because they said you can't have all this text in different fonts and you can't have it moving about the page because people won't understand and it will look like a mess. But eventually I found a publisher who is willing to take that chance, and I think it works because you can see their voices. So if you want to act it out, you could do it yourself. So all the pictures are done in different ways. So I could go, I can't remember what happens. Oh yeah, you see that's her classroom. So it shows all the people. But there you see that's her bedroom. And you're getting a sense of who she is because she says she's drawn a line down the middle, or she's made a line down the middle so that her brother knows that he mustn't put one toe onto her side. And there she is. And you see her lots of times because I want to show you how she's darting around the room, showing you things. And so you get a sense that she's a real chatterbox and she's busy all the time.
And then obviously the text in the bottom left-hand corner is all sort of squunched up.
Yeah, because she's telling you, I'm trying to squeeze everything into my room. I like to have lots of stuff. And this is another picture that shows you how they're watching TV there. She's watching TV with her uncle. And they love watching westerns, sort of cowboy films. And they're eating egg and beans on the sofa together. But you see the background, they're actually in the Arizona desert because it's as if they've fallen into the film. And that's what happens when you're really into something. You start to sort of lose the edges and you feel like you're actually there.
And that is Uncle Ted?
Yes, that's
and
Uncle Ted.
He's the uncle who's a hunkle?
Yes, he is.
And what is a hunkle?
Well, that's what the Americans asked me.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't allowed to call... That book's called My Uncle is a Hunkle. And they said, well, we can't call it that in America because it doesn't mean anything. And so we had to change the title. And I said, it doesn't mean anything in England either.
So what's it called in America?
It's called Guess Who's Babysitting. Guess
Who's Babysitting, OK. Michael's Hunkle, a better title.
And a truly deadly title.
And equally, slightly sort of fussy point, when Patrick was introducing, he slightly fudged, I will not ever, never eat a tomato, which a lot of people do. Adults find that very, very difficult to say for some reason. They get very panicked by it. But is it true that in America it's called I will never, not ever eat a tomato?
Yes, it is.
And in England it's called I will not ever, never eat a tomato? Yeah. Why is that? Do you have any help with that?
They don't like the grammar.
No,
so,
okay.
But... yes, so you asked me the question, why did I move her into novels? And the reason was because my picture books were getting longer and longer. And I think my editor thought, look, you could write more because a picture book, I think ideally is no more than 100, 800 words long. But I think that's a kind of perfect length. And mine were getting easily to 1,200, and so they become a bit more like graphic novels. So you can see, I was very influenced by comics and things, and the way I use the type is very much like in comics. And she said, well, why don't you start writing chapter books so you can take her older? And I really enjoyed that. So she kind of goes from 6 right up to 11 now. So she's 11 years old.
So this is the 4th chapter book for Clarice Bean?
No.
No, 5th.
It's the 5th.
5th.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Search. It's called Smile.
I'm thinking about that. No, it's the 6th. I didn't even... It's the 6th.
OK, it's the 6th chapter book. It's called Smile.
Yes.
Why is it called Smile?
Ah, OK. It's called Smile, not because it's about thinking positively, which I hope you get that from looking at the cover and you see that the smile is pushing her down. And that's because I think when somebody shouts smile at you, it can be very, very annoying. It's one of the most annoying things anyone can do. If they were genuinely trying to cheer you up, it is not very clever. But it's sort of... It's not acknowledging how you might be feeling. So the way to make someone smile is actually to show them the joy and bring that out of them. And joy is a communication. That sort of making someone smile is really a communication. And so I called it that because in this story, there's quite a lot of quite big things that we're having to look at. So Clarice Bean is doing a project on an animal that may become extinct. Well, that's quite a big thing to think about, really. And then one of the storylines is that there's a growing sense that something is not quite right for her dad, and he's getting these really bad headaches. And so that's something for her to worry about. And she's picking up on everybody's anxiety and mood. So how do you feel the joy when you feel this squashing down on you? But it is a very joyful book, but I really wanted to address that thing of it's not about smiling.
I mean, Clarice, in the picture books, it's less apparent, but in the chapter books, she is quite a worrier. And it seems like you have more scope to sort of develop that slightly more... Well, she's older as well, that slightly more serious thing in the chapter books.
Yes.
And for those who've read the earlier chapter books, you'll know about, she was very upset about Betty Moody leaving, and Betty Moody is still not there.
Yeah, she's missing her friend.
She gets anxious about school.
She has a rather difficult relationship with her teacher.
The awful honking goose, Mrs. Wilburton. But there is there's one good thing that's happened at school, isn't there?
Oh yes, there is one good thing.
What?
Yes.
Tell us what the good thing that's happened at school.
Okay, so it's really the reason that I'm sitting in this room, because I was writing this piece in Smile, and I'd written about Mr. Pickering, the headmaster, who's fine. Mr. Pickering is fine, but he's neither interesting or boring. He's just one of those very neutral people. And Clarice Bean's great friend Carl Rembury, he's always in trouble because he's one of those people who just can't resist letting everyone know how he feels about everything and making faces behind people's backs and things like that. He is always getting in trouble with Mr. Pickering, and he's always having to sit outside Mr. Pickering's office. He was inspired by a real boy I once saw on the television who I really liked. He was in that series called 7 Up, which I don't know if you know about, but it's a documentary. It was all about 7-year-olds. And this one started in the year 2000, and I remember I just thought he was the best. And so he talks about, in the documentary, he talks about this woman called Mrs. Ousman. And he says, Mrs. Ousman, funny name, innit? Like this. And I just always thought that was so sweet that he was listening to the name and just finding it really lovely. Anyway, so the new temporary head teacher was going to be Mrs. Ousman. But I realised when my book was edited that actually I'd already used Mrs. Ousman for a dinner lady. And so Adrian just happened to be sitting, and I went, oh no, I've got to find somebody with an unusual name. And as many of you will know, Adrian's working a lot with Mishcon. And he went, what about Mrs. Mishcon? And I thought, perfect. Plus, I love your orange notepads, of which I have a lovely collection now. And so she was written into it. And so, remind me of the page number
121.
121.
My lord.
So we've already introduced Mrs. Mishcon at this point, but this is where they're talking about her, and she's going to be a temporary teacher, and everyone's kind of thinking, oh, I hope she's going to be permanent because they really like her. So this chapter's called Smiling and Not Smiling, and I'll just read a couple of pages. After school, I'm walking home with Clem and Carl. I'm slightly wishing I'd left my whale shark book at school, since it is completely weighing me down. I think it's almost as heavy as an actual whale shark, and it is squashing my hang in there, bozo survival guide. I'm surprised Carl is walking home with us because I was expecting him to be kept back after school. We're talking about the new Mr. Pickering, who is now Mrs. Mishcon, although she's only temporary and won't last. Carl says, she's actually not too bad. I say, not too bad how? Carl says, well, when it was Mr. Pickering, you always had to sit on a normal chair and he sat behind his desk. But with Mrs. Mishcon, you get to sit in the orange ones. You know, the comfy chairs. I say, I've never sat on the comfy chairs. And Carl says, they're hard to get out of. I say, a bit like a beanbag. And Carl says, a bit, but they don't do so much moving about. Clem is not interested in the comfy chairs. She's waiting for Carl to explain about Mrs. Mishcon. Carl says, oh yeah, so she asked me why I do these things, you know, make funny faces and stuff. And I said, well, this time I wasn't actually doing anything. I was just making an impersonation of Robert. It wasn't even about Mrs. Wilburton to begin with. Clem says, what did Mrs. Mishcon say? Carl says, she asked me why I do the funny faces, and I told her I just have this buzzy thing in me. People aggravate me, and I react. I can't stop it. I know this about Carl, and it gets him into a lot of trouble. Carl says, Mrs. Mishcon says she understands this because she was a bit like that when she was a child. I don't think Mr. Pickering would have admitted he was once a child. In fact, it's hard to think of Mr. Pickering being anything young. Carl says, Mrs. Mishcon asked me if there was something that helps me calm me down when I get aggravated, and I told her about my dog walking. I said, I just really like dogs. And she said, that's interesting. I'm planning to bring my dog Radish into school because he gets lonely at home and I'm looking for someone I can trust to make sure he's okay. Carl shrugs and says, so I'm doing that. I say, so she wasn't cross? Carl says, she just wants me to practice thinking rude faces rather than actually doing them. She said, if I feel myself getting aggravated, then I should ask Mrs. Wilburton if I can visit Radish for 5 minutes. I say, I think you're probably going to get to know Radish quite well. Clem says, I wonder how long Mrs. Mishcon will be temporary for. I say, maybe she will decide to become permanent. But Carl sighs and says, I think that's just wishful thinking.
Well, we'll see whether Miss Mishcon lasts. I remember years ago a farmer's wife from Sussex paid £5,000 to charity to have her character named after her daughter, I think, in a book.
She did.
So,
and she became a whole... Yes.
So, Joe, if you could organise the check when we leave, that would be great. And Richard, we'll have a character called BCL, that's fine, we're not, you know...
Yes, that's right. It was in Ruby Redford, the whole... It was actually brilliant because a whole character came out of this and it actually really made the book. And Mrs. Mishcon, I've actually become very fond of.
She's a good... Well, Mrs. Mishcon's a good egg, and that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. So in Mrs. Mishcon, unlike Mr. Pickering, she actually sort of listens to Carl.
Yeah.
And she wants to know why he's behaving like he is.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of a theme, I think, in Smile about thinking, why is someone behaving like that? Like Mrs. Stampney, who lives next door, and she's always getting very upset with people sitting on her wall. And the one reaction is just to be annoyed back to Mrs. Stampney. Yeah. But there's also a bit of element about thinking, why is Mrs. Stampney like that? What's making her be like that? Yeah. That seemed to be a bit of a theme in your book.
It is kind of a theme in it because sometimes it's very helpful when someone's giving you a hard time or being grumpy with you or, you know, even bullying at school, I think, is to think what is going on with them that's causing them to behave like that, because it's usually nothing to do with you. I mean, in those sort of situations, like with Mrs. Stampney, it's absolutely nothing to do with Clarice Bean's family that she keeps snapping at them and telling them off. And so I have the mother who's desperately trying to keep a lid on everything. So she's been studying mindfulness, Clarice Bean's mum, and she's trying to sort of channel this inner calm. And so she says to Clarice Bean, it's got nothing to do with her wall, because she keeps saying, do not sit on my wall, do not touch my wall, I don't want anyone going near my wall. And her mum says it's got nothing to do with the wall. She's like the little dog down the street that barks at you when you walk past the gate. And obviously the dog is going to do nothing to you, it just wants you to know it's there. And Mrs. Wilburton, I think, is probably quite lonely.
Totally different question. So in Clarice's life, her family, her siblings, and even her parents are quite present.
Yes.
Whereas in Charlie and Lola world, you never see the parents. They're just not present at all.
Yes.
And why is, first of all, why do you have that distinction, which is quite sort of significant in the context of the books?
Yeah, because when I wrote Charlie and Lola, I was setting out to show perhaps just 15 minutes in a child's life. So it happens to be about a brother and sister. I grew up as one of 3 sisters, and I was remembering the amount of time that I spent just with my sisters, which didn't mean that my mum and dad weren't there, but they were busy. They weren't playing with us. Like so often your parents are busy doing other things. And I wanted to show the conversations and the travelling in the imagination that happens between children that can never happen between adult and child. So one of the sad things is when you become an adult, you sort of lose that ability to really travel in your imagination in the same way. It's not that you're not using your imagination, but you don't start saying, OK, I'm just driving around the corner and I'm in my car and everything. My sister and I used to do that for hours, pretend we were riding horses or driving a car. I would be locked up if I did that. And it's one of the great sorrows, but it's fascinating listening to it. And I always love listening to children playing and talking and figuring things out. So that's why it's just them. And you just have to imagine their mum and dad are just in the next room.
And that's a bit... Peanuts was a big inspiration for you. And in Peanuts, you never see any adults either, do you?
And you just hear a honking sound for an adult, not the words or anything.
So could you have Charlie or Lola in a chapter book?
I say no. And I've been asked that many times, would you let them grow up? And I always say you'd be so disappointed because the whole point of them is that she's, in my book, she's 3 probably, and he's maybe 7. And it's about that very particular relationship. If she suddenly becomes 6 and he becomes 11, or is it 11? I'm trying to do the maths. Whatever it is.
Whatever.
Yeah, whatever it is, 10 or something. It suddenly... It's different because she's not this wide-eyed, I'd never think of her as precocious. I always think of she's one of those children who just says why all the time. She wants to know things. That will change, and so it won't be the same. With Clarice Bean is always Clarice Bean because it's about her personality and the way she thinks. But it's an ensemble piece. It's about the family. Clarice Bean equally doesn't work without all these other characters. So it's about how do you fit into a family. Everybody's important in the Clarice Bean book, but we're seeing everything through her eyes. So when she says her dad works in a smart, marbly office, that's her opinion. She's never seen it. She doesn't know. Actually, I think he may very well work in a cubicle. We don't know, one of those really grim offices. We don't know. And I like that because everything's from her point of view.
Talking of characters in Clarice Bean world,
yes,
as everyone will know, she is a great fan of Ruby Redford.
Yes.
And she reads the Ruby Redford books.
She
There's
does.
one of them. And can you tell us the story about how they came to exist, the Ruby Redford books?
Yes. So what happened was I wrote my first chapter book with Clarice Bean, and it's called Utterly Me. And it was set in school for the first... Well, no, actually, there was a picture book set in school, but it's the first kind of really delving into what her life's like outside of the home and much more of what her life is like with this teacher, Mrs. Wilburton. And Mrs. Wilburton and Clarice, it's just one of those very unlucky things. They don't really see eye to eye. They don't get each other. And Mrs. Wilburton sets them all this book project, and she wants them to choose a book and do a project around it. And Clarice Bean and her best friend Betty Moody are absolutely obsessed with the Ruby Redford series. And I made this up this series because I wanted to be able to focus on something. You can't pick a real book series, but I wanted to pick something that Mrs. Wilburton would think was absolute rubbish, you know. So it's adventure, it's American, it's very elaborate, sort of silly plots in a way. It's about, you know, spies and undercover agents, and there's a lot of action in it. And I thought Mrs. Wilburton would hate that. And so she's very down on Clarice Bean's choice. And Clarice Bean sets out to prove to Mrs. Wilburton why Ruby Redford is such a brilliant book and that there's so much you can learn from it. And she does do that. Anyway, I'd written about Ruby Redford then in 3 of my novels, and then I started getting fan mail for Ruby Redford and children saying, where can I get the book?
Was it just children? I thought it was...
The best thing of all was that this librarian phoned up my agent from Kentucky in America and said, this child keeps coming into my library and saying, can I order in the Ruby Redford series? Could you please tell me, are these a genuine series? Because it's not in the Dewey Decimal, whatever it's called, is whatever they used to have. They used to sort of look everything up. And anyway, I thought, oh, that's going to be a series worth writing. So I did. But it was a lot more painstaking than I thought.
Yeah. But your publisher, Angeline Murta, is not here, but she was supposed to be coming.
She was supposed to be coming.
But you do you did, I remember it, but you did a 6-book deal.
Yeah.
With an advance.
Yes.
Which, as anyone has ever had an advance, I've never had an advance. You just get paid very late, sadly. Not by Mishcon, of course, but the problem is that you then get the money and then you have to produce the book. And that can become quite oppressive after a few years.
It's very nasty, actually. Never get paid up front. But yes, and I used to have these terrible sleepless nights. And in the early days of it, Adrian and I used to go to a bar, didn't we? And sometimes in the evening, and I would have written a whole thing, and then he would have read it, and then we would discuss plot lines.
Well, then you started going to hotels on your own.
Then I started having to lock myself away because it was so terrifying. But anyway, that's what. Yeah, that's how.
And
it worked.
The world, I mean, those who read the world of Ruby Redford is this wonderful sort of West Coast, glamorous. Hitch, the butler's a bit sort of like a George Clooney character. Ruby's very, very sort of smart. She's like a kind of young Jodie Foster or something like that. And they live in these amazing houses in this town, which is next to the mountains and next to the sea and, you know, has everything.
Next to the desert.
It's
everywhere.
It has everything.
Yeah.
And that, where did that come from, that world of Ruby Redford for you?
It came from my hunger and love of television when I was a child. And my mother despaired because I would watch anything and everything, including the wrestling, anything that was on, in the hope that then you'd get one of these great American shows. And I loved the idea of America because it all seemed so glamorous compared to Britain when I was growing up in the 70s. It seemed very cardboard. All the sets in British TV always seemed very handmade, whereas in America you would actually have scenery and they'd go out and it was much more adventurous. So that's really where the whole sort of idea came from. And
Ruby is this very attractive character, isn't it? She's really cool and brave and all that sort of stuff. In those books and in these, I mean, Ruby features in Clarice Bean books because sometimes you used to sort of cut to bits of a Ruby book. Oh, yes, that's right. Which you do here as well. Yes, because up there is a slide from the guide. That's a Ruby, you know, how to read people's smiles guide called Smile It Up. And then Ruby says there are 21 smiles and some of them aren't smiles at all. And then so so all the way through the book, you'll see that she's labelled the smiles and tells you what they are. So Mrs. Stampney, the next door neighbour, she's always giving you the lemon, which is like sort of rather pursy lipped, like she sucked on a lemon. And so what I wondered is, why is it important, if it is important for you, as you're a writer and an illustrator, in the chapter books, which are obviously mainly text, they all have some illustration in them?
They do.
Some's taken from Ruby, but some's taken from elsewhere.
Yes. So in this one, what you will notice is that there's some pieces about trees and bark, and I wanted to show those because there's a whole storyline about the trees that are going to be possibly chopped down on Clarice Bean Street. And some people, for very good reason, are worried that the trees are trip hazards because of the roots and slip hazards because of the leaves. And what this one amazing resident called Zarina wants to do is to make people see the other side of it all, of is there not something better we can do rather than chop the trees down? Because each tree is an individual. And she talks about the sort of different biodiversity that it supports. So they all support different kinds of insects and bird life. And the barks are all completely different. They're very beautiful. And so she gives the trees a voice. So her idea is, if trees could talk, what would they tell you about themselves? So she makes these beautiful notices that she wraps around as if the tree is telling you something about itself. And one of the lovely things that my editor said is, trees hold our social history as well. What they've seen is amazing, and what they will continue to see when we're gone is amazing. And so I wanted to sort of bring that into it. And the lovely side effect of having written about this is that I'm now working with the Woodland Trust, who plant. So if you've got a school and you want to plant trees, they give away trees if you apply for them and they think your application is good and that you really want to do this. You can plant trees, and they come along and help you do that. And their plan is to plant something like 50 million trees by 2030. That's their ambition.
In Smile, Clarice has to do this project, which, as you said, about a threatened predator, I think it is.
Predator.
And she picks a whale shark.
She does.
And that's some whale shark skin.
Skin, yeah.
Why did she pick a whale shark?
Why did she? I don't know why it came to me, but I thought about whale sharks and I thought they sound very scary because they are actually the biggest fish in the ocean. And they can grow, they don't usually, but they can grow 18 metres long. And they have 3,000 teeth. And I like this idea that Clarice would think, that sounds absolutely terrifying. And she learns about them when she's at the dentist by accident. But one of the pages has been torn out. So she's only getting half the information. So she just reads 3,000 teeth and thinks, that sounds like a terrifying predator. And I'm sorry, I'm going to spoil this if you haven't read the book, but you may probably know this. They're not actually, these really man-eating, terrifying beasts. They actually eat the smallest animal in the ocean, which is the zooplankton. And then she feels desperately sad that she's picked something that isn't very scary and in her mind isn't a predator. But luckily, Betty Moody says anything that eats anyone else is a predator. And so, that's what they look like. And they don't use their teeth at all. I think they just sieve with them or something. She never discovers really the purpose of the teeth because they don't do any chewing. But those are plankton.
She makes the plankton big and the whale shark small.
Yes.
So what was the thinking behind that?
The thinking behind that was to say, just because something is big, it doesn't mean it's not vulnerable. And just because something is little, it doesn't mean it's not powerful. And because the whale shark cannot survive without the tiniest thing, the plankton. And actually, if we have too many zooplankton, they'll eat too many plant plankton. And if they eat too many plant plankton, not enough oxygen. So she begins to see how everything is a merry-go-round of everything has a consequence. It's all about balance. So it's really important that we have everything. And if you don't believe me about little things being powerful, then I will show you. This is a cardigan of mine, which all it did was hang up in my wardrobe perfectly innocently. And you see what happens. I've actually darned it with pink, so you can see, and a bit of yellow. But they chomp through these things. So this is a clothes moth. So this is her talking about what clothes moths do. And you never catch them at it. But this teeny, teeny clothes moth lays these teeny, teeny eggs which hatch out and eat all your clothes. I mean, we had to chuck out some extraordinary number of Adrian's knitwear.
Cashmere.
I know.
Flora knitwear.
You know, it's. Yeah. I mean, it's a privileged problem, but it was very sad because you couldn't actually even knit them back together. I mean, we needed someone more expert than either of us to do that knitting, because it's like knitting that much, you know. It's patches, isn't it?
Yeah, and in this book, Clarice is knitting a scarf very, very slowly. So slowly that it's being eaten more quickly than she's knitting it.
Yeah.
So as she says, by the time she's finished, there'll be nothing of it left.
That's right. So, yeah, so that that big little theme is in there. And it's partly because I want you to remember that just because you feel small doesn't mean that you're not vitally important. You know, everything is.
On that point, because we're probably getting to questions maybe close to that now, on that point about being small not being the same as being unimportant, is there a theme in your books as well about listening to children and how we do or don't take what they have to say seriously and their anxiety seriously?
Yes, definitely, because I always felt when I was growing up that there was a lot of, if you asked a question that you're a little bit worried about, there was a lot of, oh, you don't need to worry about that, as if that makes the worry go away, and it doesn't make the worry go away. Putting together little scraps of information is usually a bit dangerous because you tend to turn it into something else. And that definitely happens in this, where people are piecing together things and don't quite know what they mean. And so the world becomes more frightening that way. I think sometimes you can be any age and you can have a great wisdom about something. And I meet children all the time who I think cut through and come up with a much better take on the world than many adults. And so I think that we are all equal. It's just a child hasn't had, you know, the younger you are, the fewer years you've had on the planet. That's the difference. But it doesn't mean some of your experiences haven't been actually bigger than an adult's, because people go through all kinds of different things. It's just your number of years and not so many.
But I suppose it depends on the anxiety. When you were little, you were very worried about rabid dogs entering the Channel Tunnel and overrunning Britain.
I was very worried about that.
No one's worried about rabies now. So that...
And a lot of people of my age were worried about rabies. And that was because... So rabies is dogs sort of going a bit mad. They get this virus, don't they? And they go a bit loopy, and so they're terrifying. But it's very, very rare. It's a very, very rare condition. It's just, I think there was a drama on TV at the time about this. And I'd mixed that up with the bubonic plague. So if you've studied the plague...
And then the Channel Tunnel.
And then the Channel Tunnel terrified me, because I knew that people weren't allowed to bring dogs into Britain without quarantining them. So I imagined that every dog in Europe must have rabies, or there must be, not every dog, but there must be a lot of rabies going on. And so that's why they didn't let them in. So then in my mind, I thought, they build that tunnel, we're going to be in really big trouble because they're going to be charging down and they're going to be biting everyone. And that is what I mean about having a little bit of information and someone not stopping and going, you don't need to worry about that. That isn't what's going to happen.
But on the other hand, Clancy Crew, for example, who's Ruby's great friend, he's terrified of sharks.
Yes.
Irrationally terrified of sharks. And so are you.
Something
And no matter
share.
how many times anyone tells you or Ruby tells him, don't worry about it, Clance, you're just, you can't go into the water.
No, I have a deep fear of sharks. And of course, that was because of the film Jaws, which I don't know if any of you have seen, but again, anyone of my generation, they were really spooked. A lot of us were really spooked by that. And I didn't see the film at the time, I just saw the poster. That's all it took.
That was enough.
That was enough.
Yeah.
And then couldn't go swimming anywhere, and I mean anywhere. And I've really had to kind of work up to it. So I'm a bit better now, but still in my head, I'm thinking, ooh. And even when we went to Devon, and there was a shark, but it was not a dangerous type of a shark. And I was quite worried.
Well, it's 2:45.
Yes, so we should
So we should try and
ask the audience.
ask the audience, yeah. I don't know how the best way to
I do have a question from one of our online viewers. Thank you very much, by the way. I thought that was really interesting, so thank you for sharing that with us. So David Hoynes would like to know, children often read a few paragraphs and then leave the room. Is Smile a book children would return to again and again, do you think?
Oh, what, you just give up on something? Is that...
I think what David's trying to say is that they don't read it in its entirety, so they're coming back.
Oh,
Is it
I
a book
see.
you can dip into and out?
Oh, I see. I don't know. I mean, it works best as a story arc because it's very threaded, I'd say. So that, what would you say about that? I feel like everything weaves in quite carefully. So if you've forgotten bits of it, it makes it more difficult to pick up on the message. And I don't mean there is a message that you have to get. I'm not there to tell you what to think. But there are various messages that you could pick up on. And I think that there are some books where you can just... I know exactly what he's saying, that you can dip into. And you certainly could read the first chapter of this, the introduction, and it would give you something, and probably the last one would as well. But I think it works best as a story.
Do you write Clarice Bean and Charlie and Lola and Ruby Redford based on people that you know, or based on people from your childhood, or the person that you are?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. All of that. But usually what happens is, and I've even written a little note about this at the end, so where I say many of the characters in my Clarice Bean books are named after, based on, or inspired by people I know, acquaintances, friends and family. So Waldo Park, who, if you know the Clarice Bean novels, he appears pretty much in all of the books, and he's the shopkeeper. He owns a sort of one of those sort of organic health food shops, and he was a real person, and he called himself Waldo Park. That wasn't his name, but that was his joke name, and so I put him in the book. And he is possibly one of the only characters who is based absolutely and utterly on one person. Most people are a little bit of this person, a little bit of that person, and a little bit of my imagination. But sometimes what I do is I put somebody's name in my book, like my friend Lucy. She's called Lucy Mackay, and I think she might be in Don't Look Now, and I just mention her. But she's not really a character other than it just says I walked to school with Lucy Mackay. And I just wanted to check whether she read it, because she said to me, oh, I read all your books. And I thought, I'll see about that. And it was really funny because she phoned me up and said, I saw my name. So yes, it was just a sort of cheeky trick. But that's a good question.
Can I ask what came first, your love of writing or your love of illustrating?
Oh, definitely my love of drawing. I never meant to be a writer, and I didn't really mean to be an illustrator. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but I always loved drawing, and illustration is a lovely thing to do because it really stretches your mind. Because when you illustrate, you are not just slavishly drawing to the words. Actually, what you're doing is usually the reverse. You're trying to pull meaning out of the words and say something with the drawing that isn't said in the words. That's really the objective. So yeah, I loved that, and so the writing was very much secondary to the drawing. Yeah.
With your favourite characters that you write, are they often the main characters?
Oh, how do you mean that I become fond of the... Yes. Oh, that is a really good question. I don't think anyone has asked me that. So I would say what tends to happen, it's quite an odd thing, but it's a bit like with Mrs. Mishcon, for example. That was just going to be a name, and there wasn't really going to be much at all about what she was like. But then I became interested in what her motivation was and how she was going to make a difference to Carl. So although she doesn't have a very big part, she's very important to the story because it's him feeling understood. Finally, an adult is really understanding who he is. So if I wrote another one, she might again appear because she would have a purpose. So in the Ruby Redford books, there's a character called Quent, who's just this very annoying friend of the family, and Ruby is always trying to get away from Quent. And then he just appeared in I think in one book, and then the actress who read the books for the Audible, so you know when you have an audio book, we had this amazing actress called Rachel Sterling, and she read Quent with such a funny voice that I thought I've got to write him into the whole series now because I really like hearing her do him. So sometimes that happens. Yeah.
What made you choose the style of drawing that you use on the front covers of the books?
Oh, so that she looks like this, you mean? Oh.
Can't really do anything else, can you?
Well, I can draw in different ways, but so actually if you look at Charlie and Lola, they're much more cartooned. So they tend to have much bigger faces and fewer features. And I think that was inspired by the Charlie Brown style, because I was Charlie Brown crazy when I was little. And I think I learnt that how you can show a lot of expression with very, very few features. Then when I did Clarice Bean, I don't know if I've got a good... I'm trying to work... Oh, so you see it a little bit here in this. You can see that actually they're drawn... You can see my style in there, but they are very different from the Charlie and Lola ones because they're in proportion. They're a bit more... you know, like they could be real people almost. And then if you see, I did Mary Poppins, where you'll see that's much more classical type of drawing because Mary Poppins, I wanted it to look a little bit more like the film, so you connect the two things. So they're drawn in a very different way. But I think probably what the connection is a lot the collage, because, you know, even on these covers you can see that this is made of... In fact, it's made of the envelopes. I use a lot of patterns inside envelopes and things. And so, I don't know, Clarice Bean suddenly emerged. But actually, if you look at the picture book and then you look at some of these, you'll think, oh, gosh, she's changed quite a lot. But that's because I guess what I'm trying to show you is how we look different depending on how we're feeling. So I wanted... Clarice Bean very deliberately sort of changes shape sometimes, and you see her look much more sketchy when she's cross, perhaps. So I don't know if in this one, so she looks like that on the cover, but then you see how she can also, she can look like that, and she can look like this when she's in trouble. And I've made her go, so she's really scratchily drawn and she's in black and white. And that's because I want to tell you that she's feeling really, really fed up and miserable because she's been punished. But the colour around here, this sort of green, which I think of as rather a poisonous green, shows you what her mood is. So she's not sorry for what she's done. She's just angry about the fact that she's been told she has to go to her room. So that, you know, that's where that idea
Can you remember what she had done?
Yes, she's tipped spaghetti hoops over her brother's head.
Yeah.
So they fight a lot, yeah. So, yes, you...
So I love the fact that your books are so filled with amazing characters, and they definitely feel like character pieces, and I mean, that's what we've always loved about, and we love Charlie and Lola so much. Is there a character out there that you wish was yours, that you read and you just think, oh, I wish I'd come up with that person?
There are a lot, yeah. Well, apart from all of the Peanuts characters, I think that's absolutely brilliant. The Moomins, I wished I'd come up with that idea. I think it's amazing. And it's also very deep. It goes very deep because she was talking, Tove Jansson was talking about her life and the things going on and the oppression she was feeling and the war and everything. And depression, all kinds of things, is all in that children's story. So it's amazing. But then there are characters, particularly by this American writer who you may not know now, because she's called Florence Parry Heidi, and she wrote the Treehorn books, and it's about this boy one of them is about a boy who shrinks. It's called The Shrinking of Treehorn, and it's very, very funny. And she manages to do it with this incredibly dry wit. But what it taught me reading those books is that she's always on the side of the child. So you feel it as you read that, you know, she's kind of poking fun at adults, really. And it's brilliant.
Are there any books that you've only written one of instead of, you know, with Clarice Bean, you've written loads?
Absolutely.
But you might just choose a story and think, I'll write one of that, and see,
it works.
See if people are finding that better than this, and sort of finding out, testing about what people like. And so basically, are there just any other...
Yeah, I know what you're saying. So sometimes what happens is I write a book like... I've written a book called That Pesky Rat, which is really about a rat who doesn't understand why people don't want to have him as their pet. He's a street rat, and people tend to scream when they see him because he looks all dirty and unpleasant, and he lives in a rubbish bin. And I wrote that as a picture book, and it worked so perfectly as one book. And then someone said, oh, you know, could you write a sequel? And they're like, no, because it is what it is. And I think it would have spoilt it to write beyond that. And then I wrote a book called Beware of the Storybook Wolves, which is about these wolves. Have you read that one? And it's about the wolves escaping from their storybook and terrorising this little boy. And I wrote that because a boy had written to me saying that he was scared of my book, I Want a Pet, because there was a lion on the cover and he thought it was going to eat him. And I thought, that's good, I'm going to write that. But then I was able to write a sequel, so I wrote a second book to the Storybook Wolves, because it seemed like a really natural thing to do, to have the boy fall into the book. But I don't know if I'd ever write a third. You know, it's like, it's a perfect pair of books. So sometimes I have another idea, but I generally don't write a book just because someone says, oh, I really enjoyed this, I want you to write another one. If I can't think of an idea, then I think, oh, just stay as one.